Reading 4, I Met You in a Story, Bob Jones University Press, 2nd edition. Mort and the Sour Scheme by Tim Davis, illustrated by Tim Davis and John Burke.
A puckered plan. One night, way in the very back of the old refrigerator, in the corner that no one ever cleans out, someone or something was grumbling. It was the quiet sort of grumbling that people can't hear. It was the grumbling of sour, spoiling, forgotten food. Now, if there's anything that food hates, it's being left to spoil, because when somebody finds it, he just says something nasty about it and throws it away. Food doesn't like that at all. In fact, although it's hard for humans to understand, food likes being eaten by people, and it especially likes to hear a satisfied on its way down somebody's throat. Way in the back of the refrigerator, Mr. Lemon and his sour friends knew they'd never get a chance to be enjoyed by anybody. They were too spoiled and sour. The more they thought about it, the more sour they got. "Aw, we'll never get eaten," grumbled Mr. Lemon. One of the rotten eggs muttered his agreement. "Yeah, that really makes my yolk boil. We didn't ask to be left back here. I'll bet sweet little Miss Sugarbowl never got left back in this smelly corner of the refrigerator," sneered Mr. Lemon. "She gets used every day," grumbled an ill-tempered egg. "I just love to stick her back here for a couple of months," said Mr. Lemon. "She wouldn't be so sweet then." One of the rotten eggs spoke up. "Why don't we then?" "Yeah," a chorus of sour pickles joined in. So the rotten group huddled together to work out a nasty sort of kidnapping plan. On the rack just above them, a little mushroom named Mortimer hid and listened. "Oh no," he thought. "How could they do such a thing to sweet Miss Sugarbowl? I've got to warn her." Mort knew he wasn't strong enough to push open the big refrigerator door by himself, but he had heard about a secret exit up through the freezer far above him. Mortimer could sneak out and warn her that way. Quickly, he started off in that direction, but before he had gone 2 steps, his foot slipped on a bit of oleo. Mort fell off the rack with a clatter. The noise startled the group below him. Mr. Lemon looked up at the terrified little mushroom. "Looks like a spy. After him." 3 sour pickles slid off their jar and started after him. Mort quickly shinnied up the cool ketchup bottle to the next rack up. Then he sprinted towards a large bowl of vegetable soup, covered with a clear plastic wrap. With one tremendous leap, he landed right in the middle of the stretched wrap. Like a trampoline, it bounced him up to the dip tray of the freezer. The pickles were gaining on him until they reached the bowl of soup. The first one jumped onto the plastic wrap, but he weighed much more than Mort did. Splat! Into the soup he went with the plastic wrap stuck all over him. "Never mind him. After the spy!" shouted another pickle. They quickly stacked up a few containers and climbed up into the drip tray. But the little mushroom had reached the other side. He hopped up to the latch of the freezer. It was just a lightweight aluminum door, but it took all of Mort's might to open it just a crack. By then the sour pickles were right behind him. He squeezed right into the freezer. The pickles pushed the freezer door open a crack more and rushed into the frigid compartment. Mort saw a hole almost covered by frost. The secret exit. He brushed aside the icy crystals and crept through the opening. It led to the back of the refrigerator, near the top. He felt the warm kitchen air on his face as he peeked out. The little mushroom climbed a few steps up to the smooth white top of the refrigerator. There was only an electric clock and lots of dust up there. The cord on the clock ran down the side of the refrigerator to an outlet over the counter. Mort shinnied down toward the counter below. The pickles spotted him and quickly slid down behind him. Mort dropped onto the counter and ducked behind the cookie jar. A few seconds later, the first pickle ran by. Where was the second? Crawling on his hands and knees, Mort peered cautiously around the cookie jar. Right in front of his nose was a pair of slimy green feet. He looked up above him stood a pickle wearing a nasty grin. The pickle grabbed at him, but Mort ducked and took off in the other direction. Mort looked up to see where he was running, and his heart froze. In front of him stood the other pickle, holding a long, sharp blade. A long, sharp knife. The blade alone was bigger than Mort. The little mushroom looked around. The edge of the counter was on one side, and the wall and a toaster on the other side, and the two nasty-looking pickles stood behind and in front of him. Mort was trapped. He scurried to the top of the toaster and jumped into a slot. It was just big enough for him. Whew! At least they can't fit in here, Mort thought to himself. But the pickles walked over to the toaster, grinning at each other. One turned the temperature setting all the way to high, while the other pulled down the handle. Inside, the wall started to glow red hot. Mort looked below him, trying to get as skinny as he could. He squeezed through the wires toward the bottom. It was getting mighty hot. He had to hurry. Plop! The mushroom dropped onto a tray full of burnt bread crumbs. It was still pretty warm down here, but at least it was tolerable. Mort waited patiently for his chance to escape. I don't hear much sizzling in there, remarked one of the pickles. Maybe you'd better take a look. The pickle with the long knife climbed to the top of the toaster and looked down both slots. I can't see him, but it's pretty bright. The pickle poked his knife down into the slots. Say, I wouldn't do that if I were you, the other pickle warned. Why? Zap! A charge of electricity sizzled through the surprised pickle. Meanwhile, Mort took the opportunity to squeeze out of the bottom of the toaster and run. There's the rascal, cried the last pickle, and he took off alone after Mort shinnied up a vase of flowers. Then, like a squirrel in a tree, he jumped from stem to stem, petal to petal, until he got to the very top. There, stretching until it almost hurt, Mort reached out and grabbed the bottom of the shelf of the cabinet, whose door was open. He pulled himself up and into it. Then he stopped to catch his breath. The clumsy pickle climbed up the vase. He jumped and gripped the cabinet's edge. The mushroom turned quickly and ran smack into the sleeping pepper shaker. Pepper flew everywhere, especially onto the nose of a snoring bag of flour. The big bag wrinkled his nose just as the pickle pulled himself up into the cabinet and stood grinning nastily at Mort, who huddled into the corner. Choo! The flour bag sneezed with all his might, sending the sour pickle flying over the edge in a powdery blizzard of flour. Oh, thank you, Sir Mortimer gasped. The big bag boomed. Thank you. Thank you? Why, I just blew your friend right out of here. I'm terribly sorry. I don't know what got into me. Well, I'm not sorry, the pepper piped up. What do you think you're doing running around at this time of night? There I was, sleeping more peacefully than a pea in a pod, and then you— Just a minute now, Mr. Pepper, interrupted the bag of flour. Let's not get all hot under the collar. Well, okay, Mr. Pepper relented. Explain yourself. The bag and the shaker listened carefully while Mort told them the whole story. And they're out to get Miss Sugarbowl, he finished. No, they wouldn't, the flour was shocked. Not to get sweet little Miss Sugarbowl. We won't let them take her away, Mr. Pepper declared. You're right, we won't, agreed the bag of flour. So the three of them asked the other foods in the cabinet to help them protect Miss Sugarbowl from Mr. Lemon and his rotten friends. There were many brave volunteers. Together they planned their defense. Mr. Lemon and his sour gang had just about finished their scheme when a knock came at the refrigerator door. Some rotten eggs opened the door and let in a bruised and flour-covered sour pickle. Mr. Lemon looked up and grumbled, "Don't tell me he got away from you, too." The pickle glanced toward the wall, where his two sour friends stood hanging their heads. One was sizzled, and the other still had plastic wrap twisted all around him. The pickle felt quite embarrassed. "Now our surprise attack is ruined," an egg shouted. "Don't give up on me so fast," sneered Mr. Lemon. "We'll kidnap her just the same." He got a nasty twinkle in his eye. "I have something that will slow them down." He dug deeply into the very deepest corner of the refrigerator and pulled out a large container with a lid on it. "I've been saving this for a long, long time." As he pried open the lid, the smell convinced them all that he was telling the truth. "This," said Mr. Lemon with a chuckle, "is my special mixture of old molasses, stale peanut butter, and Limburger cheese, and it's the stickiest substance ever devised." "Ooh!" the pickles gasped in amazement. "I call it goo," Mr. Lemon continued. "If we all coat our hands with oleo, we can throw this stuff wherever we wish, and it will stop any of Miss Sugarbowl's defenders right in their tracks." So the sour group started out of the refrigerator, dragging the container of goo along with them. Just as they neared the counter, one of the pickles howled out in pain. "Youch!" "Shh," said an angry egg, "and get that silly toothpick out of your toe. What's that doing?" Before the egg could finish his question, a flying toothpick stuck him in the nose. "Yow!" he shouted. Suddenly, there were yelps all around them. Toothpicks were everywhere. They were dropping out of the sky. "It's an air attack!" yelled a pickle. Above them were floating dozens of soap bubbles. Each one carried on it a tiny chocolate chip, throwing toothpicks for all he was worth. "Use the goo!" shouted the angry Mr. Lemon. So the eggs and the pickles flung goo back at the floating chocolate chips. Several of the soap bubbles burst, sending their pilots to the kitchen floor and covering them with a sticky, smelly goo. "Advance!" Mr. Lemon cried, but Miss Sugarbowl's defenders had pulled all the low-hanging electrical cords up onto the counter. Mr. Lemon kept handing out more goo to the pickles and eggs. They threw much of it up to the counter where Miss Sugarbowl and her friends were stationed. "What is this disgusting substance?" cried Mr. Pepper. "I don't know," the bag of flour replied, "but it's horrible." "Oh dear," Miss Sugarbowl sniffed. "All this trouble just for me." Now, Mr. Flour Bag calmed her. "Don't get all worked up." "Look out!" cried Mort. A slimy pickle climbed onto the top of the counter. The bag turned and blew out a powerful blast of white flour, sending the pickle tumbling backward. Mort ran and peeked over the edge. "They've all got goo on their hands and feet, and they're crawling right up the side." "Get the vegetable oil!" shouted Mr. Flour Bag. A banana and several marshmallows ran off to the cabinet and returned with a bottle of oil just in time. They poured it over the edge where the pickles were climbing. Splat! Down they slid to the floor. "Ha ha!" laughed Mort, peering over the edge. That ought to hold them. He dodged a bit of flying goo. "That's all the oil we've got in that bottle," reported the banana. "And we're down to our last box of toothpicks," added a chocolate chip. "Throw the goo back at them, then," said the bag of flour. It might have worked, but the goo smelled so strong that several of the defenders fainted from the odor. Some of the pilots fell from their bubbles and were badly bruised in their fall to the floor. Many others were hopelessly stuck in piles of goo, even up on the counter. The rotten foods could handle the goo much better. Slowly but surely, Mr. Lemon's troops were gaining ground. We're almost out of oil, cried a marshmallow. Oh, dear me, sobbed Miss Sugarbowl. What can we do? Mr. Pepper threw up his arms. Even Mr. Flowerbag was getting nervous. Why, we've just got to think of something. We need some help, big help, and soon. We can't hold them off much longer. Mortimer thought very hard. Miss Sugarbowl moaned. Sniff. Maybe I should sniff. Just give myself up. No, you mustn't do that, said the bag of flour. Besides, they'll probably take us all prisoners now anyway, squealed Mr. Pepper. Mortimer dodged a blob of goo and kept on thinking. Finally, he exclaimed, Rover! Rover the dog? Mr. Flowerbag looked puzzled. What are you talking about? Rover. He can help us, answered Mort. That's no good, cried Mr. Pepper. First of all, he's chained outside by his doghouse. And second, he'd eat us just as soon as he would any of Mr. Lemon's gang. And I, for one, am not about to be eaten by a dog. Being eaten by a dog is, of course, one of the worst things that can happen to most kinds of food, except, of course, dog food. It's our only chance, said Mort. Besides, I'll take all the risks myself. You'll never get across the floor to the kitchen door, cried the pepper shaker. If the piles of goo don't stop you, Mr. Lemon will. The window's open, said Mort, thinking hard again. But that's on the other side of the room, Mr. Pepper yelled anxiously. You can shoot me out of the window with the toaster. As fast as they could, they all rushed over to the toaster, dodging goo all along the way. Mort climbed into a slot. Carefully, the flour bag and the pepper shaker aimed it toward the open window. A little to the left, a voice called out from the toaster. Okay, that's good. Miss Sugarbowl turned the setting to low and pulled back the handle, setting the spring. Are you sure that's right? She asked. Yes, just shoot me out. It's getting hot in here. Sproing! Mort soared across the room and out the open window. Oof! He landed hard in the soft grass. He shook himself off and then ran to the doghouse, a few feet ahead. Rover was sleeping like a log in the moonlight. First, Mort unhooked the chain from Rover's collar. Then he kicked Rover right in the nose as hard as he could. But Rover just grunted a little in his sleep and licked his nose. Without wasting a second, Mort climbed right up next to Rover's ear. As loud as a mushroom can, he yelled, Get up! Rover stirred a little. He scratched his ear. His big paw knocked the little mushroom right into the water dish. Splash! Then Rover settled back to sleep. Mort climbed up onto the edge of Rover's dish. He was soaking, wet, and nervous. Time was running out back in the kitchen. The water! That's it! Mort cried. He slid off the dish and quickly found a stick and a flat stone. He put the stick under the edge of Rover's dish and pushed the stone under the stick. It made a wonderful lever. By yanking down on the other end of the stick, Mort flipped the water dish right over. It splashed into the sleeping dog's face. Ruff! Rover awoke at once. He looked all around. Down near the water dish, Mort stuck out his tongue and made a funny face. As soon as Rover spotted him, Mort turned and ran full speed toward the kitchen door. Gruff! Rover took off after the little mushroom, with every intention of eating him in one gulp. Mort ran out of the grass and onto the sidewalk. He could feel Rover's hot breath on the back of his neck. He sprang up the little doorstep and across the welcome mat. Rover charged up behind him. When Mort got to the door, he slid underneath it. Rover leaped through the doggy door and crashed into the kitchen. But he suddenly stopped and held his head high. and sniffed the air. It was that smell. A smile formed across Rover's shaggy face. Limburger cheese was Rover's favorite thing on earth, even if it was mixed with old molasses and stale peanut butter. Like Raider, the dog's nose located the source of the unusual smell. Pickles and eggs had goo smeared all over their arms and legs. Mr. Lemon, who had been standing in the container, handing it out, smelled more like Limburger cheese than anything else in the kitchen. Rover trotted toward Mr. Lemon and his gang. "Rover!" the sour old fruit cried out in horror. "Retreat!" So all the rotten eggs and sour pickles took off after their leader. Desperately, they ran toward the refrigerator. Just then, the light flipped on. Every bit of food in the kitchen closed his eyes and lay completely still. A pair of fluffy bedroom slippers shuffled across the floor. "Rover," came a lady's voice. "What on earth have you done?" Rover tucked his tail between his legs. She looked around. "What a mess you've made!" She sniffed the air. "Eek! I don't know what's made this pickles, eggs, and lemon smell so terrible, but they're going outside in the trash can, and you, Rover, are going back to the doghouse." The lady scooped up Mr. Lemon and his rotten friends in a paper bag. Then she took Rover by the collar and headed toward the door. After taking out Rover and the bag of trash, the lady flipped off the light and shuffled back to bed. "I'll clean up the rest of this mess in the morning," she yawned. Up on the counter, Miss Sugarbowl and her friends cheered quietly. Mr. Pepper reminded them, "We must be sure to get all the goo washed off our friends before morning. If we don't, they might get thrown away. That stuff is so terribly untidy." Miss Sugarbowl bounced up and down with excitement. "We've won! We've won!" "You did it, Mort," Mr. Flowerbag said, smiling as wide as his face would let him. "Oh, thank you, Mort," sighed Miss Sugarbowl. "You've saved us all from a bitter end." Mort smiled in his shy sort of way as Miss Sugarbowl kissed him on the forehead. He had never felt any sweeter in